Well, it wouldn't be a day on the Sports Bash without football at 4. And, of course, that means John McMullen joins us as he does every day on the Boardwalk Kind of Hotline. Make sure you're following him on Twitter at JF McMullen. Eagles news, NFL news, a little XFL will mix in as well with John as we do every day on the Sports Bash here on 97.3 ESPN. John, happy President's Day. That's why you're talking to me instead of Mike Gill.
Happy President's Day. Yeah. It's not too many people that take off on President's Day. You got to work for the government or you got to be Mike Gill.
Yeah, well, you got me and Schweimer today filling in on the Sports Bash. So
what's up, John?
Hey, Schweimer. How are you, buddy?
Long time no see or no hear, man. Well, actually, I hear you on the Sports Bash every day at 4, but you don't know that.
You can set your watch to it.
So last time I saw you, we were drinking shots at the
Landmark,
Tony Bruno show.
Yeah, those are good times. It's always a good time when a pretty girl buys you shots.
Well, John, I'm sorry to ruin on ruin the reunion here, but I did want to talk some football with you, if that's okay. So
I'm here for you.
So,
shots, football, whatever you need.
Football. So obviously, for those who don't know, the news came out earlier today. Adam Schefter and others putting it out there that Darius Slay, the quarterback for the Lions, could be on the trade block. Now we know that he's got a bit of a fat salary. So, what is your perspective on him as a potential target for the Philadelphia Eagles?
Well, you make a lot of sense. I said that at the trade deadline as well. I mean, that's a position the Eagles obviously need an upgrade. They're going to go in a different direction pretty clearly. It's just a matter of how different it's going to be. Are you going to bring back Jalen Mills? Potentially. I can't see any way they're bringing back Ronald Darby, even at a discounted rate again for a second consecutive season. So you could be looking for one starter, two starters. And this is a top 10 cornerback in this league. I still believe that. Problem is he's under contract, as you mentioned, at $10 million. The salary's not bad for the type of player. Cap numbers north of $13 million, but he's going to want a new deal in any trade type situation. So that's a guy who'd be looking to be the top, the highest paid cornerback in football. So that's the kind of high ticket price and item you'll be in the mix for if you go down that route.
Now, he is 29. I think he's either 28 or 29 years old. Is that an age that you think the Eagles, though, would be comfortable with? Because we know that Howie Roseman said we need to get younger. So is that age precluding maybe some interest in him at all?
Yeah, I think it is. Certainly, you have to look at it. We all know you prefer in any – certainly as you go into free agency, you prefer to get guys coming off their first contract. There would be about 25, somewhere in that range, and hope they project. Anytime you have a player approaching 30, it's always a bit of a concern. But the Eagles have had a lot of problems developing players at that position. So at some point, you almost have to jump into the pool and say, we got to get a proven guy, because it hasn't worked out with draft picks, whether it's Rasul Douglas or Sidney Jones. Hasn't worked out with trades and Ronald Darby. The one guy who's probably overachieved nobody likes, and that's Jalen Mills. So sometimes you have to do those things because you haven't been able to solve the position in other ways.
John, the Eagles would have to obviously trade for him. I don't know who the Detroit Lions would be interested in, but what about Darius Slay's reputation around his reputation around the league? I mean, is he a solid guy? What's the inside scuttlebutt on Darius Slay?
Well, he's a good player, and everybody knows that. I would say he's a top 10 corner in this league, and that's the problem. You're not only talking about a deal that would be in the range of the top paid cornerbacks in the NFL, but you also have to give, as you mentioned, Billy, assets back. So it's not like Detroit's going to give him away. And that's what was talked about at the trade deadline as well. They wanted a significant package. And I know a third-round pick in Sidney Jones, I forget, I think it was Mike Clay who threw that out. I don't know why the Detroit Lions would accept that. I think it would start at a second-round pick, and it might even be a first-round pick. So it's not an easy deal to make, and I don't know if the Eagles are willing to go to the lengths it would take to get a player like that. You might have to wait till next year. If Darius Slay is intent on getting out of Detroit, you might have to wait until free agency next year.
John, you look at the salary cap for the Eagles. It looks like they got I have about $40 million under the cap. Is that correct?
Yeah, they have no issues under the cap. Last couple of years, they've been up against it because of all the maneuvering they've had to do. This year, it's no issue. But I always talk about the salary cap as a whole. Even the past few seasons, when on paper it looked pretty dire because of everything they did. It's not a hard cap. It's a soft cap, and that's the strength of Howie Roseman as a GM. He's always going to be able to manipulate numbers. So they have no issues with the cap this year, this time around, and they can get negotiations with any player they would like. The bigger issue is the decision making, and that's you only have a certain amount of assets, and the bigger question is the decisions you make and how you allocate them. So I think that's people get too caught up in the salary cap because any team, even the teams, there's certain teams that are projected to be over the salary cap, and they're going to have to cut players before March 18th. But even those types of teams, they're going to have no problem getting under the cap. Everybody gets under the cap. It's not an issue for anybody. It's the issue is the decisions you make to get there.
And the cap went up too this year, right? I mean, it goes up every year.
Yeah, it always goes up. Yeah. And that's it's generated by revenue, and obviously the NFL's TV is an ascending contract as far as TV rights go, so it always goes up. It's going up about 10%. So that's not the key. The key is, as I said, the decisions you make, the positions you value, and who you decide to go after, and do you hit home runs or do you not? And that's the bigger issue. That's always the bigger issue.
John McMullen joining us on the Boardwalk on the hotline on 97.3 ESPN. Make sure you're following on Twitter at JF McMullen for all your Eagles and NFL news. John, when it comes to the Eagles, we know they need a lot of things. They need cornerback help. Obviously, they need wide receiver help. They need a lot of different things. So of all the things they need, is cornerback the position that they'd rather have a veteran at, or is there another position they'd rather have a veteran at when they're trying to fill some of the voids for next year?
That's a good question. I mean, I think a lot of it depends. It's not – you don't want to pigeonhole yourself and say we need a veteran wide receiver and we can go young at corner or vice versa or any other position. It kind of comes down to who you like on the free agency market. And then if you're able to get those players, then it kind of shifts your draft thinking. So we always talk about everyone in these mock drafts are projecting the Eagles to go wide receiver. Well, if they sign a wide receiver, they're not going to draft a wide receiver. So that would shift their thought process in the draft. So it's not really about, hey, we need a veteran presence there or vice versa. And if you look at last year, I mean, the Eagles had plenty of veterans and wide receivers didn't work out. So it's about finding guys who can make a difference on the offensive side of the football. I would say that from just their perspective, and the fact that this team is obviously the most important player on this team is Carson Wentz, I think the most important thing they need to do is solidify the playmakers around him, because those guys just did not perform last season, and you can't have that again this year. You have to fix that. Doesn't matter how you do it, but you have to fix it.
John, when you look at also this offseason, how much do you think what the Eagles do is going to be? Are they going to be, in many ways, try to be first out of the gate to get some of these people, or do you think they're going to lay back a little bit and see how the market plays out?
Well, it's sort of, if you have a player like Anthony Harris as a player, I've often cited would be a perfect fit for the Eagles. If they have interest and that's the player they want, you got to strike early. So if you're talking about those types of players, the players who get to free agency and are top level players at their particular positions, you have to strike in the first 24 hours, 48 hours, or you're not going to get them. It's as simple as that. So it kind of depends on how you have projected things and players you want to go after. But I always go back to the Eagles and their Super Bowl winning team, and they won that in the second phase of free agency. They won the Super Bowl with signings like Patrick Robinson and Chris Long and LeGarrette Blount, and those are the cost-effective signings. And if you hit on those, that's where you get depth, and that's where you kind of separate yourself as a team. By nature, if you're going after those high-priced items, whether it's a Harris, a Amari Cooper at wide receiver, you can talk about how good they are and how good of players they are. They're always going to get overpaid. So that's what you're weighing. Do you want to overpay someone to bring them in? Because if you're talking about that type of player, you are going to have to overpay them.
Hey, John, what about Byron Jones? He's still available, right, from the Broncos?
Cowboys, but he's projected to be a free agent. So obviously, you still have time. If you're a team and you have a pending free agent, you can still work something out before free agency starts. That's another guy. He's at the top of the list at the corner position. So you're going to be talking about a guy who's going to make a lot of money, a guy who's going to get overpaid. And that's a good example because Darius Slay is a better player. He's a better corner. He's a more proven corner. He's more consistent. Jones might have more upside. You might think that way. You might think he's younger. You might think he's a better fit from that perspective. But as far as a proven perspective, a guy like Darius Slay would be better. So that's, do you want to pay Byron Jones, who's probably not a $15 million corner, at least right now, or a guy who probably is, but then you also have to trade assets on top of it?
John McMullen here on 97.3 ESPN. John, I want to flip it over now to some NFL news. Some quarterbacks in the news over the last few days. First of all, today, Melvin Gordon told CBS Sports about Phillip Rivers, quote, "I think he'll go to the Colts." And he pointed out the connections that Rivers has, the guys like Frank Reich and Nick Sirianni. So how much of a viable option are the Colts and Phillip Rivers for a possible reunion there for those guys?
Yeah, I think they're a very viable option. The two teams everybody has always mentioned with Phillip are Tampa Bay and the Colts. So I think those are the first two teams you're going to look at. And Tampa has to make their own decision first on Jameis Winston if they want to continue down that road. And for whatever reason, people in Indianapolis, I think Jacoby Brissett did a pretty good job in a difficult circumstance. Because remember, just the timing of Andrew Luck's retirement, the shock, almost all of losing a player of that caliber at that stage of the process. I think he is a legitimate starting quarterback in this league. And from both of those teams' perspectives, I talked about it a lot with Tom Brady. I don't know why a new organization would want to start over with an aging quarterback who's in his late 30s, early 40s. I don't understand that thinking from a football perspective, unless Indianapolis thinks they're a quarterback away from winning the Super Bowl. I don't know if that's the case, but I do think that would be one of the two logical landing spots for Phillip Rivers.
Well, that kind of leads to my next question is, if Phillip Rivers did land in Indianapolis, we know that Brissett was the starter last year. Do they draft a quarterback and then let that guy back up Phillip and let him learn under Phillip? Or do they try to bring back Brissett to have a more stable, well-known commodity as the backup quarterback then?
Well, I mean, it's a very important position. Indianapolis thought in a lot of ways that they had the best backup quarterback when Brissett was there under Luck, and they could go back to that similar circumstance. But now you have a guy who probably thinks that he's earned the starting spot and would at least want to compete for the starting spot. So now you have ego involved and you have all that stuff involved. So you may have gone too far down that road to assume that Jacoby Brissett's going to just say, okay, I'll go back and be a backup because, as I said, if you look at there's 32 starting jobs in this league, I think you would be hard-pressed to name 32 quarterbacks better than him. So by that definition, he should be a starting quarterback in this league.
John, another report that came out over the weekend was there's a report that the Raiders are ready to offer Tom Brady a 2-year, $60 million contract. How much of that is real and how much of that is a smokescreen?
Well, John Gruden doesn't like Derek Carr. I can say that. So they want to go in a different direction at the quarterback position. Although John Gruden is famous for falling in love with quarterbacks and falling out of love with them as quickly as you know, when they buy his shot and then leave the bar. So he's famous for that. And if he gets a 43-year-old Tom Brady, he's not going to be in love very, very quickly. Second part of that is, okay, 2 years, $30 million. Like Tom can't get that anywhere else. Like that's some exorbitant sum. They're not paying attention to the current landscape. And if Tom is thinking about leaving New England, you would think it would be to maximize his earning potential and make as much money as possible. And that would lead me to believe Los Angeles Chargers, simply because they have to sell tickets in that huge stadium in Los Angeles, and they're not going to be able to sell them without a high-ticket item like that. But from a football sense, I go back to Phillip Rivers. It doesn't make sense for the Raiders. It doesn't make sense for the Chargers. It doesn't make sense for anybody other than the Patriots. And even that, you could argue they should probably turn the page. But we talk about the sentiment surrounding Eli Manning. Look how long the Giants hung on to that. Well, times that by 1 million. It's tough to move on from Tom Brady. You almost have to swallow the medicine and say, okay, Tom, continue to play as long as you want to play because you've done so much for this organization. But nobody wants a 43-year-old quarterback, or nobody should want a 43-year-old quarterback.
Yeah, I think the Patriots are in a position they can't get rid. They can't get rid of Tom Brady. He's done. You just said it. He's done so much for the organization. There's no way they're going to let him walk. They're going to give him whatever he wants. Kraft and love.
Yeah, I've always thought he would be back in New England. I don't think it makes a lot of sense. And as I said, if the football guys are making the decision, believe me, they don't want Tom Brady. So the only way it would make any sense is that business perspective is an organization that needs to sell tickets, needs to make a splash from that perspective. Maybe the Raiders want to do that with the move to Las Vegas. Who knows? But I'll say this. I would hate to see him in a Raiders uniform, a Chargers uniform. And we've seen it in the past. I'm old. I remember Joe Namath limping around
in L.A.
In a Rams uniform. Even Emmitt Smith in a Cardinals uniform. Joe Montana was actually pretty successful with Kansas City, but still, it just looks bad. You hate to see it.
Hey, John, what about people talking about Amari Cooper possibly? The Eagles showing some interest in Amari Cooper. Now, I personally wouldn't do it because he's a Cowboy, a former Cowboy, and that every time it seems like the Eagles grab a former Cowboy, it just never works out. But do you think the Eagles would have some real interest? I mean, he's only 27 years old.
Well, I think they'd have interest in him as a player, but he's going to cost a ton of money. And remember, this team, it's not easy. They have Deshaun Jackson under contract, who makes a lot of money. They have Alshon Jeffrey under contract, who makes way too much money, and they can't cut him because of the salary cap is exorbitant. Nobody's going to want to trade for him because he's not healthy, and he's always talking to Alshon to Josina Anderson when he has a couple in him. So I don't, you're going to add another. Amari Cooper's probably going to be the highest paid receiver in football if he gets to free agency. You're going to add that to what you already have. Again, I think people look at these things and say, well, yeah, he's an upgrade, so you should go get him. Well, no, duh, he's an upgrade. I mean, everybody's an upgrade practically from what went on at that position last year, but the salary does come into it, and that's what I was just talking about, allocating your assets. You can't pay top-of-the-line money to every player at every position. I mean, people want Amari Cooper. They want Anthony Harris. They want Darius Slay. You can't do that.
John, we got to talk some XFL before we get out of here. So the XFL had net attendance growth for week 2. Now, part of that was because 29,000 people showed up in Seattle, but it seems like the XFL is growing, about a 9.5% bump from week 1 in terms of attendance. So, it seems like in terms of at least people being interested, the XFL is trending in the right direction.
Yeah, I don't know. That was the home opener in Seattle, as you mentioned, and those are their two. St. Louis as well. They've got about 30,000 tickets out when they have their first home game as well. So that's going to skew it a little bit. They were down a bit in D.C., and I think Houston was at home. They were down a little bit attendance-wise, but it wasn't. It was 17,000 to 15,000 or something. Ratings are going to be down because the one game was on FS1. Nobody watches FS1.
You gotta find it, John. You gotta find it. People have to go looking for it.
Come on, John. You gotta find that station.
Well, no, but there's something to be said for the fact that if it's not on ABC, Fox, CBS, it's harder for people to find it, whether we would like it or not.
Yeah, it is. And FS1 is even different from ESPN. I mean, ESPN is a part of their sort of daily way they go about things, and FS1 hasn't been able to break through, and that has nothing to do with the XFL. So, in general, when the games do get forced on FS1, they're not going to do as well ratings-wise. But I don't think that's that important. You focus on the other 3 games, and if they hold up decently, I think it's fine. But we'll see. I mean, my biggest issue is the quarterback play. And boy, the bad quarterbacks are bad. And there's a couple. Cardell Jones has been really good, and PJ Walker's been great, the former Temple star.
Right.
St. Louis's quarterback, I forget his name. He's been pretty good.
Timo.
Yeah, and Landry Jones was rusty, but hopefully he'll get a little bit better. But, man, those bad quarterbacks are bad.
Yeah, that was the final thing I wanted to ask you, John. That is, how much of it is I mean, I'm not saying the quarterbacks aren't rough to watch because Matt McGloin's first half was just horrible. But also, are we overlooking the fact that, is it possible that maybe the defenses in the XFL were, better equipped and maybe better than maybe we expected?
I mean, from watching some of the games, some throws are there and they're just missing them. So, I mean, if you have a receiver streaking open and you just miss them, that's on the quarterback, and you've seen that a little bit too much. But, yeah, I mean, we talk about it all the time in the NFL. Everybody boils everything down to the quarterbacks. Well, Patrick Mahomes is better than so-and-so, so they're going to win. And nobody talks about the other 52 players. So, in the XFL, there's 51 players, but yeah, I mean, other people can win football games. It's not all on the quarterback. but when you do have poor quarterback play, it's more. I'm talking more from the aesthetic side. It turns the game into an ugly entertainment vehicle, and if it's not pleasing to the viewer, well, they're going to change the channel. So that, to me, is the bigger concern.
Follow him on Twitter at JF McMullen for all your Eagles and NFL news all year long, and some side commentary on the XFL when John finds it appropriate to point out some things. Of course, again, JF McMullen. Check out all of his work at 973ESPN.com. John, catch you tomorrow.
All right, thanks, guys.
Have a good one, John.